Well, I was actually talking to George on the way to church this morning. He was telling me what car I was going to buy him when he passes his driving test, which is slightly premature given that he is 14. I might say it's slightly optimistic as well. But it did get us chatting about when I passed my driving test, which was a long time ago. And it's fair to say I wasn't a natural when I was learning to drive. I put it down to an incompetent driving instructor, frankly, who I was at odds with, and we fell out most lessons. He was a real know-it-all, frankly. Anyway, eventually I persuaded him that I should be put in for a test. And I will never forget the man's face when the driving examiner got out of the car and walked past him and gave him a nod of affirmation that I passed my test. The look of surprise on that man's face was frankly unprofessional. But I thought I will show him and everyone else who was questioning how long it was taking me to learn to drive, because it had taken a while and I'd saved up quite a lot of money in the process, and so I was able to buy myself a car. I thought, what I'm going to do is just go out and buy a car and just show everyone that I've got a car and a license to drive it. It would be fair to say I didn't know very much about cars and how to buy one. But I just thought, I'm going to do it. And the next day I went out and I walked into town. The Lord was with me, clearly, because without too long I found this little used car sales room. I'd never seen it before, to be honest, but I went in there. And what a blessing. I went in there and I found an honest used car salesman. He wandered over with his stay-press suit and his ridiculously big tie, and he was full of the joys of spring. I told him that I'd just passed my test. Well, he was so happy for me, but he was even more elated when he heard that I'd got some money and I was going to buy a car. I got the money with me. He was so happy for me. I couldn't believe it. So he asked me what my budget was. I told him exactly how much money I had with me. And he said, well, we've got just the car for you. We looked around. I couldn't see anything in the showroom that my budget would allow me to get. But then he put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. It was like the Lord was speaking to me as he whispered to me, I've got just the car for you. It's out the back. It's not even in the showroom. It's only just come in. I was going to get a bargain. He said, I'll be honest, it's not showroom ready, so it's not that clean yet. So he took me out the back and he showed me this car. It was filthy. But he said, look, it is what it is. It's not being prepared for the showroom. And at the moment, I can't lay my hands on the full service history, whatever that was. But he was going to find it and send it on to me. And this car, hang on, you're all laughing, but this car came with 2 months free road tax at no extra cost. So the deal was done. And then he said to me, this is what sold it. He said, I can assure you, young man, there is nothing by way of reliability like the Austin Maestro. So that was it. I bought this car. 6 months later, that was scrapped. 6 months later. I think it didn't even last 6 months, I reckon. It was rubbish. Everything went wrong that could go wrong with the car went wrong with it. It was ridiculous. The point is, if I'd gone back to that man and said, why didn't you tell me the truth why didn't you tell me the downside of buying this car? His observation would obviously be, well, I'm a salesman, mate. It's not my job to tell you the downside of this, the bad bit. It's just my job to shift the product. This morning, as we carry on thinking about different facets of Jesus' character, you might say of Jesus at times, he's not the best salesman. Sometimes you think you could just water it down a little bit. Some of the awkward truths that he seems so preoccupied with telling us about. If you just diluted the gospel a bit, because let's be frank, the people that have come after Jesus and preached the gospel haven't been worried about diluting the gospel. Hopefully we don't do that here. Just leave the awkward bits out. But this morning we think about Jesus, the provocative teacher. Provocative, I would accept. Antagonistic, never. Never. He's never out to crush or reduce or ridicule people. But the greatest teacher we've ever had was so preoccupied with the truth. You see, he came to give us life and life in all its fullness. We know that from John's gospel. But he knows how you get there is the truth. It's the truth that will set you free, right? And the truth is sometimes difficult. The truth is sometimes the last thing we want to hear. So what we're going to do is think about those verses that George read to us before he cleared off. From the most famous sermon ever preached, the greatest sermon ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount. You'll find it in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5. If you've got your Bibles, we'll work through that. It's the first teaching you find in Matthew's Gospel, and then chapters 5, 6, and 7 is this incredible Sermon on the Mount. And the reason we're going to look at those verses that we thought about earlier is it's safe to say actually, it's up there with the most misunderstood teachings of Jesus. Turn the other cheek, right? It's the most misconstrued, misunderstood, manipulated teaching of Jesus, the provocative truth teller. I was watching a film this week, and it was quite a violent scene, and then this kind of biblical retribution, an eye for an eye, was brought up. And then, ironically, the line, turn the other cheek, was mentioned in this film. And it struck me that every time I hear it, in this day and age, it's either in an ironic or sarcastic context. You see, it's the loftiest love ethic I've ever heard, turn the other cheek, right? And whilst no one would contest if the whole world did that, this world would be in a better place, but people dismiss it, not because it's cheap, but because it's lofty and it's unrealistic. And that's the problem with your Jesus. He comes out with this stuff that's unrealistic, unattainable. It's a nonsense. So they dismiss it. The question is, if we take a look at what Jesus says, is it unrealistic? Is it unattainable? When you start the Sermon on the Mount, it's an incredibly constructed sermon, obviously. This is Jesus, and he's quite a good preacher. He begins with the Beatitudes, and then he talks about salt and light. What he's saying here, briefly, is that you and me, we can be the salt and light, we can be distinctive in this world. We can be what he wants us to be, what we're called to be, what our holy destiny is to be. We're fit for purpose. And then he talks about, briefly, the fulfillment of the law, that he's not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. And then he unpacks various facets of the law. He unpacks it. The point he wants to make is this. When you become a Christian, you get this interlinked set of radically transformed relationships. When you become a Christian, you get this interlinked set of radically transformed relationships. That is to say, that when I become a Christian, when I become saved by grace, that's how I became a Christian. Nothing to do with what I did, but because of what Jesus does on the cross. Okay, then in faith, I accept God's gift of grace, and I am sanctified, I am saturated by his grace, and I am transformed. So my relationship with God is radically transformed, okay? That's the point of Jesus coming. He comes to restore the fractured relationship between God and his people. So I'm saved by grace. I have this radically transformed relationship with God. And you just heard something lovely from Ali Cox on that video that showed this incredible weekend. She was reminded that she is an unconditionally loved child of God. All right? That's true about you. It's true about me. When you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior, that's the truth about you, okay? So not only do you have this radically transformed relationship with God, you have this radically transformed relationship with yourself as you understand who and what you are as a child of a king, okay? And then Jesus says, because of these radically transformed relationships, there must necessarily be a radically transformed relationship with other people. And it's symbiotic. They're inextricably linked. You can't have one without the other. You can't say, oh, I'm in such a good place with God, and I'm really happy about what I am as a new creation, but he is still a jerk. Jesus says, as he unpacks the sixth commandment, this is the point he's making. So he explains what we can be. He explains what the law is, that it's still relevant, that he's come to fulfill it. And then he unpacks. He talks about, you've heard that it said. He doesn't say it is written. So he's not reiterating the law. He points out that I know you know the law. He says it is written, don't murder. And then he says, but I say. And then he says the same about adultery. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I say, and then divorce, but I say, then keeping your oath, but I say, and then he says, you've heard, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. And we'll unpack that presently, but the point here in verse 21, he says, you've heard that it is said, do not commit murder. And anyone who commits murder will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. That seems a brutal comparison, doesn't it? Again, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. Anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. But his point is this. So you have this radically transformed relationship with me, with yourself. It must necessarily mean that you have a radically transformed relationship with other people. That word Raka, it's not Greek, it's Aramaic. Jesus, although the Bible was translated into Greek, you understand he spoke Aramaic. And Raka, it's not a word I wouldn't say to you Raka. It's more of how I feel about you. Raka means like nothing. You are nothing. Like I'm more intelligent than you. I don't think that, by the way. It's an example. I'm more intelligent than you. I'm more successful than you. I'm more important than you. I'm more masculine than you. I'm more effeminate than you. I'm more popular than you. Or I am more than you. Raka. And he says, if you call someone a fool, that's a Greek word, moros. It's where we get the word moron from, which I assume I don't have to unpack. But you understand how you can't have this relationship intact, and this relationship intact, and this relationship in bits. That is the difficult truth that Jesus starts with. And then when you understand that, he moves to this law that they would be very aware of. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. It might seem a vulgar and primitive way of doing things to us in the 21st century, but it was actually a massive step forward in terms of justice in the ancient world. It was a law called lex talionis. That's Latin. Lex talionis, it literally means law retaliation, law of retaliation. So, and it was intended to protect the underdog, really. It was so things couldn't get out of hand. It might be an extreme example. If you gouge my eye out, I'm allowed to gouge your eye out. What I'm not allowed to do is gouge both of your eyes out and cut your legs off. That would be a disproportionate response to you gouging my eye out. So in the old days, it's like, you kill my cow, I'm going to burn your farm down. And actually, when you think about it, isn't that how this world sees justice? You do this to me, then you're getting this back, mate. So they knew this law, but Jesus isn't talking about the implementation of the law at all. He's saying with that understanding and with this radically adjusted relationship you have with other people necessarily, then from a kingdom perspective, there are creative alternatives. And then he gives these 4 illustrations. The first of which, sorry, it's just going that way, wasn't it? The first of which was this now infamous idea of turning the other cheek. If somebody slapped you across the face, on the cheek in the ancient world, it wasn't that they were looking for a fight. Actually, in the old days, they would still use fists and swords and sticks and that. The slap was intended as the ultimate insult. The ultimate insult. Probably with the back of a hand. most likely from a man to someone they regarded as an inferior, a slave, or a child, or sadly, a woman. And the idea that Jesus is saying here is to slap somebody back is just to circulate the evil. And then he gives this incredibly countercultural idea that you should turn the other cheek. And what he's saying is you don't run away from the bully. What I'm proposing here is not an option for weaklings. What I'm suggesting is you stand your ground, you turn the other cheek, and you give permission for them to strike the other cheek. But if they strike your other cheek, they will be doing so as an equal, not an inferior. Does that make sense? So what he's saying is completely countercultural, and it requires strength to stand up to the bully and say, you will not take my dignity. So you respond to that from a position of strength. And he's said in the verse before, what was it? Don't resist evil. Do not resist an evil person, I'm sorry. What he's saying there, perhaps a better translation is to retaliate. Given the kingdom perspective, because of the radically adjusted relationships, he's saying don't allow the ill will in someone else's heart to infect the goodwill, the Jesus-shaped love in your heart. Don't allow evil on the outside to penetrate and become evil on the inside. Don't get sucked in. That's why this response to turn the other cheek is so radical, and it requires strength and confidence and a kingdom-shaped perspective, a kingdom-shaped, a radically transformed relationship with God and yourself and other people. So then he continues, if somebody wants to take your shirt, give them your coat as well. This is a less realistic illustration, because in the ancient times that we have lots of items of clothing, they would have a tunic and a cloak, right? So if you give them both, you are naked. That's not ideal, I don't think. I don't think Jesus is saying that. Remember, these aren't laws. He's not giving you a law, he's giving you a creative alternative. It's saying if somebody's trying to take advantage of you, treat you unfairly, do not get sucked into that. Some years ago, I was a new Christian, but I had played on a recording, and a music producer had made a lot of money out of this recording, but wasn't inclined to pay the fees that was owed to the musicians. And it was quite frustrating, to say the least. And we were all getting very chewed up about it, and we were talking about litigation, and it was getting horrible. I was a new Christian, and an old saint in my church encouraged me to think about this. And what it meant for me as I was praying about it was that I just laid it down and forgot about it and let it go. I wasn't paid. And only once I had done that did I realize the extent of the bitterness that I had allowed to come into my heart. Righteous bitterness. I don't know what difference that makes, that I was in the right. It was still chewing me up. It was still like a poison. And when I laid it down, it was incredible, the spiritual impact it had on my life. Eventually, as it happens, as an aside, I did get paid, but that literally is not the point. Now, I am not saying if you run your own business and somebody doesn't want to pay their bill, you should just let them off, because frankly, you won't have a business for very long. That's not what Jesus is saying. If you have a professional obligation where you're in charge of the finances at your company, at your school, or whatever, then you need to make sure they're in order and people pay their bills. That's literally not what he is saying. This is not a law, but this is, with a kingdom perspective, a creative response to these situations. Jesus continues with one that they would have hated. If somebody asks you to go a mile, then go 2 miles with them. So this is a situation that was very realistic for them. Remember, they're in occupied times. The Romans are there, very oppressive occupiers. And there was a law which the zealots hated, that a Roman soldier could command you to carry their burden for 1 mile. Whatever their burden was, their load, okay? And Jesus is saying, if that happens to you, and it happened often, it was common practice, then you are to look this kid in the eye when you get to the end of the mile. Okay, kid, because most of the Roman soldiers were boys from Syria. Treat him like a human, look him in the eye and say, I know your job's not that easy. And maybe you're not having the best day, but can I carry this for you another mile? I could do that. Can you imagine the impact that gesture has on the young soldier who probably doesn't want to be there? Can you imagine the difference the grace of God might make in that situation, however undeserving? But it's not a law, right? So Jesus isn't saying like, you take them 1 mile, and then the Roman soldier says, thank you, this is me, I'm here. And you go, oh, no, we've got another mile to do yet. Jesus says not 1 mile, but 2 miles. And the soldiers go, but I live in. No, oh no, off we go. That would be a ridiculous idea. And that's why it's not a law. It's a kingdom-shaped response predicated on a radically transformed relationship with God, yourself, and other people. The last illustration, someone asks you, do not turn them away, give to the one who wants to borrow from you. Again, cynics might say this is so unrealistic. For example, I have a friend who has a son who wants to borrow all the time, and it would be patently unwise to give that guy money at the moment because of where his life is and what he's going to do with the money. He's going to continue to spiral out of control. It would be the most ridiculous thing to do to give him money. If you see that as a law, well, this ain't my problem. It's not a law. It's completely inappropriate to give that boy money. That's not what Jesus is saying. But at the same time, I can promise you, friends, you're never going to find that people ask for something at a convenient time for you when you're staring at a pile of money thinking, I just don't know what to do with all that gold. That's not how giving works. It's going to be costly. It's not going to be convenient. But freely you receive, freely you should give. That's what Jesus is saying. And then he sums up, what is the big deal about loving your friends? Everyone does that. How about the people who are frankly unlovable, difficult to be with? How about them? How about them? Who's loving them? The greatest teacher ever. I'm happy for him to be called a provocative teacher. Absolutely. Antagonistic? No. Unrealistic? Never. Never. What he has to say is so lofty, so countercultural, you can dismiss it if you don't take time to unpack what Jesus is saying. But you can hear what he's saying here about turning the other cheek might just change the world. If there's a church full of people loving Jesus, loving people like Jesus loved them, he's saying, come and live as transformed people by my grace. See people through my eyes. Be the light, be the hope, be the joy, be the hands that lift up the fallen. Be the feet that are prepared to cross the street and connect with the alienated. Be the ears that listen to the brokenhearted that other people have stopped listening to. Be the eyes that see the potential in the weak and the pushed down and the knocked out and the washed up. Because of the cross of Jesus Christ. because of what we're just about to celebrate at Easter. Because there was a God who came down and hung on a cross so he could be in relationship with you and you with him, so that you could understand of yourself that you are a new creation, packed with potential to be a difference maker. You then take that radical love and you go into this world with a transformed attitude to other people. So we are the hope of Jesus. We are his hands, his feet, his ears, his mouthpiece. And I'm looking out at people who are fit for purpose. Don't you dare let the devil condemn you this morning because of what you think you are not. Listen to what the gospel says you are. We are called to be game changers, difference makers. Amen.